Welcome to a deep dive. Today, we're turning our focus to Kenya. There's a really critical situation unfolding there.
That's right. We're looking at recent protests, but also trying to understand the deeper story behind them.
And for this, we're using a specific source, a YouTube video from DW News. It's titled, Protests Grow in Kenya Following Death of Anti-Corruption Blogger.
A really detailed piece of reporting, actually.
Our mission here is to kind of unpack what this video shows us, the core events, the context, what it suggests about, well, governance and the mood in the country.
And there are some, let's say, surprising details in there, particularly around how events unfolded and the messages being sent.
Okay, so let's dive right in. The source points to a specific event as the spark. It centers on this figure, Albert Ojuang.
Right, an anti-corruption blogger. The report says he died shortly after being arrested.
And the initial police story?
The official line, according to the source, was that he hit his head against a cell wall. Self-inflicted, basically.
But that's not where the story ends, is it?
Not at all. This is a crucial point in the video. It brings in autopsy findings.
And what did they show?
Well, they directly contradicted that official narrative. The source details injuries, bleeds, a hematoma on his head,
Okay.
but also widespread injuries on his body, his limbs, his trunk. The report suggests this pattern made self-inflicted injury seem, well, highly unlikely.
Highly unlikely. Yeah, that sounds about right, given that description. So this contradiction, this gap between the official story and the physical evidence reported.
That seems to be what really ignited things. It sparked protests, but also, a much bigger national conversation about police violence.
And the source mentions this went pretty high up,
Yeah.
like officials being questioned.
Yes, the interior minister, senior police leadership, they were questioned in parliament about Ojuang's death. So significant attention.
It shows how one incident, when the explanation feels off, can just tap into something much larger, right?
Exactly. It stops being just about Ojuang and becomes about accountability, trust in institutions, things like that.
So how did the protests themselves start, according to the video?
Initially, peaceful. The source shows people gathering in Nairobi near government buildings, police headquarters, sit-ins, peaceful demonstrations.
Focused on police brutality initially,
Yes, that was the main theme at the start.
but it didn't stay peaceful.
No. The reporting details a clear escalation. There was a specific afternoon where things changed.
What happened?
The video showed a standoff with police, stones being thrown. Police used tear gas. There were even images of burning cars.
Wow. And there was something else mentioned in the source, something quite disturbing about who else was involved.
Yes, this is a really striking detail. The video shows young men armed with whips and batons,
Okay.
and they're seen beating protesters. But the source explicitly states these were not police. They were civilians.
Civilians, armed, attacking protesters alongside police actions.
That's what the footage reportedly showed. It raises immediate, serious questions, doesn't it?
Like, who were they? Who directed them? The source doesn't say.
It doesn't provide those answers, but just showing that civilians seemingly acting as enforcers paints a really unsettling picture. Lines blurring, maybe unofficial force being used.
And amidst this escalation, the demands of the protesters also changed.
They did. Initially, it was about justice for Ojuang, accountability for his death. But then, the source says, a very specific demand emerged.
Which was?
The resignation of the Deputy Inspector General of Police, IG Lagat.
Why him specifically? That's quite a high-level target.
Well, the source explains this is linked to extremely serious allegations. Allegations that IG Lagat himself ordered Ojuang's abduction and killing.
Ordered it. Wow. Okay, so the focus shifts from general accountability to targeting a specific, very senior official based on these claims.
Precisely. It ups the stakes considerably.
Did the government respond to this pressure at all? The source mentions an arrest.
Yes, they did arrest a police officer, a Constable Muana.
Okay, so some action taken.
Some action, yes, but the source immediately shows the protesters' reaction to that
How do they see it?
as insufficient. They viewed Muana as a scapegoat, basically.
A scapegoat?
Yeah, their position, as reported, was clear. This arrest doesn't address the core issue. They want IG Lagat held accountable. Until then, the protests continue.
There was also something about the timing of that arrest announcement.
The source points out it happened right as the national budget was being read. A very high-profile moment.
Interesting timing. Strategic, maybe.
The source doesn't explicitly confirm it was strategic, but it definitely notes the coincidence, especially given, past tensions around budget announcements. It raises the possibility.
It speaks to that potential trust gap, doesn't it?
Right.
An action meant to show accountability is seen possibly as just political maneuvering.
Exactly. It highlights the difficulty leaders face when public trust is low.
So let's pull back a bit. The source connects Ojuang's death to a wider pattern, right?
Yes, and this is crucial context. It states Ojuang is reportedly just one of dozens of government critics who've disappeared in recent years. Dozens.
Dozens. That reframes everything. It suggests the fear and anger aren't just about this one case.
Absolutely. It tacks into a much deeper anxiety about dissent and safety. The source also links it to earlier unrest.
The Gen Z protests.
Yeah, from the previous year.
Yeah.
The source notes over 60 people died then, and the anniversary is coming up. So there's this historical weight.
That's a heavy backdrop. And the source clarifies it's not just young people protesting now.
Right. While youth are heavily involved, it's described as cross-generational, which leads to the question, why such broad-based anger?
And the source digs into those underlying reasons.
It does. It outlines major economic and governance frustrations, big ones.
Like what?
Like the government trying to raise taxes, even on essential goods. At the same time, there's this perception of widespread government waste and corruption.
So people feel squeezed financially while seeing the government as corrupt or wasteful. That's a potent combination.
A very potent combination. Plus, the source mentions policies seen as hurting businesses, causing unemployment, basically making life harder.
It sounds like a feeling that the system isn't working for ordinary people.
That's the strong impression conveyed. Life getting worse, the government demanding more, and opportunities shrinking. For young people especially, the source quotes a journalist saying they feel like there's no future for them in the country.
No future. That's a fundamental grievance. It goes beyond just policy disagreements.
It really does. It's about survival, about hope.
This brings us to another really striking part of the source, the interviews with journalists, Eric Magendi and Odanga Madung.
Yes, investigative journalists, they talk about the climate of fear.
How so?
They mention colleagues being abducted, injured, arrested. They feel threatened themselves just doing their jobs.
And they offer an interpretation of what's happening, don't they, about
Yeah.
Ojuang's death and these other incidents.
A very chilling one. They suggest these abductions, the killings, that they're not random. They're intended as communication.
Communication.
As a message. To instill fear. To warn anyone else who might speak out or challenge the authorities. One journalist in the video says it explicitly. The brutality is the message.
The brutality is the message. That's incredibly bleak. Violence is a deliberate communication strategy to silence people.
A stark assessment. The idea is, see what happens if you cross the line.
But the source also shows the response to that message.
Yes, absolutely. The counter message from the protesters and from journalists like the ones interviewed.
It is
Defiance, a refusal to be silenced, despite the risks. The journalists talk about the importance of just being visible, of hiding in plain sight by continuing their work, continuing to protest.
So it's fear versus defiance, a direct challenge.
A very direct challenge to that message of fear. And the source notes this isn't easy. Media covering the protests are apparently targeted too,
Targeted how?
with attempts to delegitimize their work. The source mentions government claims that media are being funded to support the protests.
Undermining their credibility, trying to control the narrative.
Exactly, which just makes it harder for anyone to understand what's really going on. It adds another layer of pressure.
Okay, so let's try to connect these threads based only on what the DW News source presents. We have alleged state violence against critics.
Questions about accountability reaching very high levels, like with the IG Lagat allegations.
Then there's the perceived disconnect, government policies, corruption, waste on one side, and real citizen hardship on the other.
Right. And layered on top, these attempts to silence dissent, control information, even target the media reporting on it.
Taken together, what does this picture drawn from the source suggest about the leadership challenges in Kenya?
Well, it depicts a situation where leadership actions or alleged actions, like the violence and lack of accountability, seem to be actively fueling public anger.
Instead of calming things down.
Instead of calming things, yes. The economic pain is real, the frustration is real, and the responses described in the source, the alleged violence, the scapegoating, the attempts to silence, they seem to exacerbate the situation.
It suggests a real breakdown in trust, maybe, and difficulty in addressing grievances in a way people find legitimate.
I think that's fair to say, based on the source. It points to a leadership challenge in navigating deep public anger, possibly using methods that only deepen the cycle of tension and conflict.
It paints a picture of leadership struggling, perhaps relying on tactics that escalate rather than resolve.
Precisely. The source suggests an environment where peaceful dissent feels risky, making confrontation more likely.
All right, let's recap this deep dive. We focused entirely on the information presented in that DW News video.
We started with Albert Ojuang's death in custody, the conflicting narratives around it, and how that became the immediate trigger.
Right. Then we saw the protests escalate, the demands shift towards high-level accountability, specifically targeting IG Lagat over those serious allegations reported in the source.
We looked at the deeper context, provided that pattern of disappearances, the echoes of previous deadly protests, and crucially, the widespread economic pain and governance frustrations fueling the anger.
Yeah, the feeling that life is getting worse, while the government demands more and is perceived as corrupt.
And we finished with that stark interpretation from the journalists in the source. Brutality as a message of fear.
Met by this powerful countermessage. We will not be silenced, even in the face of alleged targeting and attempts to discredit them.
So, pulling only from this source material, it leaves us with something to think about, doesn't it?
What's that final thought?
Well, consider this, based on what we've just discussed from the source. What happens in the long run when public anger over hardship, corruption, and alleged state violence gets so intense that simply protesting, simply being visible, becomes an act of defiance against that perceived message of fear? What does that tension signify for the future path of a country?